Thank you very much for inviting me here. It's an amazing show, and it's a privilege to be part of it. What we have here is an old farmhouse. This was my home in Sussex. It's where I grew up, and I was completely unaware that our visitors were some of the greatest artists of the 20th century. Picasso, Man Ray, Max Ernst, they were among them. But to me, they were just a bunch of amusing, benign people who were friends of my parents, Lee Miller and Roland Penrose. Here they are in Arizona in 1946, visiting Max Ernst. My father, Roland Penrose, was born in 1900. He was a poet, a writer, and a Surrealist artist. He went to Paris in 1922 to become an artist. He studied with André Lotte. He met Braque. He became fascinated by Cubism. But about 18 months later, he went south and bought this little house in the village of Cassis-sur-Mer, near Marseille. And he lived happily as an expatriate, painting in a style that owed much to Cubism. A strong, pleasant style. But this was not one that would earn him the present position he holds in the history of modern art. For that, he needed a catalyst. And one day, when he least expected it, that catalyst arrived and rang his doorbell. She was dressed on that occasion, but not for very long. They fell in love and they were married in 1925. Her name was Valentine Bouet. She was a poet already known to the Surrealists, to André Breton and Paul Éluard, and she introduced Roland to them. And Paul Éluard introduced Roland to the Surrealist painter, Max Ernst, seen here with Marie Berthe, his wife. And Max, preeminent among the Surrealist painters, was the ideal person to introduce Roland to the principles of the movement. In contrast to the negativity of the Dada movement, which preceded it, Surrealism was a genuinely positive new way of seeing and living life, offering an ideal for the future based on fairness and enlightenment. Surrealism was way more than an art movement. It was a revolution, a counterculture, and the Surrealists rebelled against the establishment in all its forms. They were fascinated by Dr. Freud's theories of psychiatry and wanted to explore this newly discovered territory, the subconscious. They placed great importance on the images of dreams. It was in Max's studio that Roland saw this painting. He said he found it so marvelous it was as if he had fallen asleep and woken up in a foreign country. It was by the Catalan artist Joan Miró. Miró was a Surrealist artist, but he didn't spend much time with the group. He was a loner. He just worked away quietly all the time. And later Roland would own this fabulous early work, Maternité, and Miro's Tête du paysan catalan. Their importance is they mark Miro's explorations in the world of dreams and the moment he left the more figurative painting of his early work. But back in Max's studio, Max had just adapted and developed the technique of frottage. He hit on it when staying in a house that had very worn floorboards. He put the paper on the floorboards and he rubbed them all over with pencil, discovering the exposed wood grain. In this work, he's turned the dead wooden boards back into the leaf of the tree. And here he's used the leaves of a chestnut tree to form the wings of his dragonfly. These last two frottages are from a 1925 series titled Histoire naturelle. The Surrealists loved finding the marvelous in the everyday, and it's really easy to find the marvelous in nature. Max encouraged Roland to experiment with frottage, and this is one of Roland's early works. It was a technique that gave Roland ample scope to record his own dreams and fantasies. And in Roland's paintings, we find the wonderful ambiguities and erotic fantasies of Surrealism. Is that a cloud of steam? Or is it the woman of Roland's dreams? You choose. Max was also the master of this genre, the collage. He used to snip up steel engravings to make these strange, wonderful figures. Collage making was a way of undermining authority and skewing perception. It's also a celebration of the chance and finding the marvelous in the ordinary. Some of Max's images are scary. There's often an undertone that suggests a cruel attitude towards women. Valentine found the images of women as victims of violence offensive, but in truth she had already turned against Max. She felt he was exploiting Roland. And the feeling was mutual. Max painted Valentine like this, hard-faced and implacable. The genius here is the second portrait. You see, her face is absent. There's a blue void. Valentine had found that she wanted a journey of meditation and contemplation towards nirvana, and she was already on her way, and Max recorded that. In 1936, Roland and Valentine had to admit their marriage of 11 years had failed, and Valentine left Roland and went to live in India. And Roland left France and returned to England as the ambassador for Surrealism, which was virtually unknown in England. And he set up the first international Surrealist exhibition. This is the lineup on the opening day. Salvador Dali, Paul Éluard and his beautiful wife, Noosh, Eileen Elgar and Sheila Legg, two British women Surrealists. Here's Roland, here's Herbert Reed, here's Edouard Mezens. The show was an incredible success. It was attended by 1,000 people a day for 23 days. Dali famously arrived to give his lecture in a diving suit, chosen to penetrate the depths of the subconscious. He damn nearly made it because he nearly suffocated. Dali was central to the Surrealist movement at this time, but later his love of fascism was to cause an irreparable breakdown. By today's standards, the show would have been a blockbuster. Picasso was very close at this point to the movement thanks to his friendship with Paul Éluard, and he lent, and works by just about all the known Surrealists of the day were featured, including Max Ernst, who had several works in the show, also Man Ray, and so did Roland Penrose. At a personal level, this was the moment that Roland first met the spirit of Lee Miller, because this huge painting by Man Ray, L'Heure de l'Observatoire, is of Lee Miller's lips. Lee Miller, that's her second to bottom here. She had arrived in Paris in 1929 and she'd become the pupil and the assistant of Man Ray, who's seen here at the bottom of the pile. And under Man Ray's tutelage, Lee Miller had become a photographer. She photographed Max and Marie Berthe in 1929, and I find it astonishing that she was so close to Max, Marie Berthe, and Man Ray, who were all close to Roland, yet she did not meet Roland Penrose until 5 years later. In the following spring of 1937, Roland was back in Paris on a mission. He wanted to buy this painting. It's called Nu sur la plage, 1932, by Picasso. He had seen a reproduction, only in black and white, in a magazine called Cahiers d'Art. He went to try and find it. It was not in Picasso's dealer, Rosenberg's gallery. But thanks to the intervention of Éluard, Roland was able to buy it direct from Picasso. And this was the beginning of Roland's collection of works by Picasso, but it was also, more importantly, the beginning of a friendship between him and Picasso that lasted until Picasso died 37 years later. But in June of that same year, Roland was back in Paris visiting Max Ernst. Together they went to a fancy dress party given by the daughters of the couturier, Monsieur et Madame Rochas. Roland had not been at the party for very long when he was transfixed by the gaze of a pair of piercing blue eyes. He described the experience as being struck by lightning. He was never the same again. He had met Lee Miller. It was love at first sight, and they were inseparable for the whole of that summer. She was his first Surrealist muse incarnate, the woman of his dreams. Lee Miller was American. She was born in Poughkeepsie, upstate New York, in 1907. Her career started in a big way when, in Manhattan, she stepped off the pavement in front of an oncoming truck. The man who pulled her back and saved her life was a very good choice because his name was Condé Nast and he was the owner of Vogue and Vanity Fair. And a few weeks later, she was on the front cover of Vogue, March 1927. She was not yet 20 years old. And that brought her to the attention of Edward Steichen, who was the chief photographer of Vogue magazine. And Steichen found she had the perfect looks for the beautiful evening wear, for the casual wear, for the sports wear. And his photographs made her into what we would today call a supermodel, coast to coast, Vogue and Vanity Fair. But Lee was bored with this. She ended her modeling career. She went to Paris. She said, "I would rather make a picture than be one." And she went to find American Man Ray, one of the foremost of the Surrealists, whose name in that moment meant modern photography. Immediately she became his model, his pupil, his muse, and his lover. And some of his best-known works in his whole career are those of Lee. But underlying these lyrical, erotic images, there was a huge tension. After my mother died, I found this page from Man Ray's notebook among her papers. His handwriting tumbles backwards and forwards across the page in a wild, swirling script. Elizabeth, that was her given name. Elizabeth, Lee, Elizabeth. You can feel the pain. It covers a mask-like face of Lee drawn in pencil. When I unfolded it, out fell this photograph, slightly larger than life. It's her eye. I thought, how beautiful. And then I noticed something that made my blood run cold, because on the lower eyelid, he had taken a very sharp pencil and with a lot of pressure, written his signature there. There's something sadistic about poking a pencil into your lover's eye and writing your name on this vulnerable place. And I began to understand why when I flipped it over and I found this poem on the back. The date is important, October the 11th, 1932, but the last line tells me all I need to know. I am always in reserve. Man Ray was a wonderful man, but he had this really intense ego. And for him to put himself in reserve was an incredible step down. But Lee sailed blithely on above all the jealousy. And despite his jealousy, Man Ray generously encouraged Lee to become a photographer, a Surrealist photographer. And her early works show that strong Surreal style right from the start. This is a clinic. The figures here are painted on the wall. The woman is real. The baby is real. But the baby being dressed in white merges seamlessly with the painted figures. It blurs the distinction between reality and illusion, and that is something the Surrealists loved to do. This lady is Claude Cahun. She's a woman Surrealist photographer and poet who lived in Jersey on the Channel Islands. Her self-portrait of about 1925 inspired Lee, and Lee made this drawing. It's a preparatory sketch for her own photograph. And I think it was the metaphor that appealed to her. You will have seen glass domes like this in museums. They always contain little beautiful stuffed animals, something that's been captured, deprived of its liberty, and used to enhance the status of the owner. It's a trophy. And Lee, as a beautiful woman, was constantly fighting off men who wanted to turn her into a trophy. She posed her friend Tanja Ram under a similar dome. Again, the captured trophy woman. And Man Ray shared the session. And in Man Ray's version, he blindfolded Tanja, makes her even more helpless, subjective, a captive. And then Man Ray put the image into this painting, where the man is smug, self-satisfied, leaning back, gloating over his captive, his trophy. One of Man Ray's most famous works, Object to be Destroyed, reflects his fury with Lee towards the end of their relationship. She claimed it was like making a wax voodoo effigy to stick pins into, and she had justification for that because, of course, it was her eye on the pendulum of that metronome. The night she left, you remember the date on the poem, the 11th of October, 1932, Man Ray went nearly suicidal. The person that was with him was terrified that he really was going to shoot himself. But luckily, his humor took hold, that black humor, and he turned it into a dark joke by putting a cigarette in the muzzle of the gun, the smoking gun. And then he took 2 years to paint this picture. It's big, it's about that size, it's more than 2.3 meters wide. It took him 2 years to paint. It has 2 titles. One title is Observatory Time, because the domes of the Observatoire de Montparnasse give us the location, and that means the lips are hovering above Man Ray's studio. The other title, The Lovers, because the lips morph into the closely entwined form of 2 lovers, Lee and Man Ray perhaps, and they're taken from Lee's lips, enlarged, cross-hatched, but the genius is the way he's tilted the lips so they fly freely in the early morning sky. It's the moment he kissed her goodbye. He forgave her, and he continued to love her for the rest of his life. 5 years later, Man Ray was also at the Rochas ball where Roland met Lee, and Roland invited them all, Man Ray and his new girlfriend, Adi Fidelin, to stay in Cornwall at his brother's house. Max Ernst came with Leonora Carrington, the English painter he had just met when he was doing his show in Roland's London gallery. And then, all except Max and Leonora, went to the south of France, to Boijmans, where they had a sort of Surrealist summer camp. Here's Paul, Nouch Eluard, Man Ray, Adi, and Roland looking happy. Picasso and Dora Maar should have been there, but they'd had a huge row that morning and they needed time to cool off. And Picasso took a big interest in Lee Miller. He painted her portrait 6 times, à la Arlésienne, in the manner of a woman of Arles. We don't know the dates of the portraits precisely, but the last one is dated the 23rd of September. Lee had left Boijmans on the 18th. Picasso was still painting her 3 days after she had left. Roland bought this one and gave it to Lee as a present. And for me, the yellow face is a metaphor for the sunshine brilliance of Lee's intellect and the tremendous warmth of her personality. Lee inspired Roland to start making collages using picture postcards, and this was one of his first. He called it The Real Woman. Yes, it's about Lee because she was real, visceral, hot, full on, unlike Valentine, who was ethereal. So here she is as a frottage. And this is her alter ego, I believe, a bird about to make some salty American wisecrack. And its plumage is made of postcards. It's like cubism. The trick is, if you close your eyes a little bit, just go out of focus, they become feathers. They stop being postcards. Roland applied this technique in a great many different ways, and you'll see some examples in the exhibition. But Lee in this moment was married to a very wonderful man, Aziz Eloui Bey, and her home was in Cairo. But in 1939, she left Aziz and came to London to live with Roland and moved into his house in Hampstead. And knowing the war that was inevitable, she and Roland hurriedly made one last trip to France. They found Adi and Man Ray, Max and Leonora, trying to look cheerful, but knowing the war was inevitable and imminent. By now, Max's work represented the biggest holding in Roland's collection, ranged from Catherine Ondulata, bought from Eluard in 1937, to Joie de Vivre, bought from Max himself while the paint was still wet on the canvas. Max had left Marie Berthe, and with Leonora had gone to live in Saint-Martin d'Ardèche in France. And when war was declared, Max was interned by the French as an enemy alien, and Leonora enlisted Roland's help. and he was freed 3 months later, only to be re-imprisoned by the Germans on the fall of France. Peggy Guggenheim got him out and took him to America, but it was the end of Leonora's love affair with Max. She escaped to Spain. The strain made her temporarily insane. She finally escaped to Mexico. Max married Peggy Guggenheim and spent the war in America. Lee and Roland returned to London on the first day of the war, and Roland became an air raid protection warden, and Lee got a job on Vogue magazine as a photographer, but she was bored and frustrated. And when America entered the war, she applied for military accreditation with the US Army. Soon after the Normandy landings, she was there behind Omaha Beach, reporting on the 44th Evacuation Hospital, where the surgical team struggled to save the lives of those wounded in fierce fighting only a few miles away inland. For the next year and a half, Lee's reportage from the war in Europe dominated Vogue features. Then she crossed the line, absolutely forbidden to women. On her next assignment, she stumbled on a battle, the Siege of San Malo. The Germans were holding on to the fort that dominated the port. It took the US 83rd Division 5 days of fierce fighting, a dose of napalm from the US Air Force, and Lee was there when the commander, Colonel von Auchlock, surrendered. But no chance to sit on her laurels, because the race for Paris was on, and she arrived on the very first day of liberation, describing the streets being filled with screaming, cheering, pretty people. As soon as she could, she made her way to Picasso's studio. He hugged her, he kissed her, he stood back and he said, "C'est incroyable." It's incredible. The first Allied soldier I should see is a woman, and she is you? That has to be a surreal moment for Picasso. She found Paul and Noosh Eluard. Noosh was to die a year later. Paul followed her in 1952. Because Paul's poems had been seized upon by the French resistance as a rallying cry. His poem, Liberté, j'écris ton nom, that was enough to earn them the attention of the Gestapo. They were on the run for the whole war. They died because of it. But not even Paul or Noosh could keep Lee in Paris in the winter of 44-45, because the toughest fighting of the whole war was taking place. The Germans had their backs to their own frontier. And Lee was there when the Allies punched into Germany, and Lee was there when they began liberating the concentration camps. Buchenwald, Ohrdruf, Penning, and Dachau. This is Dachau. And in this moment, the war, which had become very personal to Lee when she arrived in Paris, became bitterly and irrevocably personal, because so many of her friends had gone missing, and now she knew what had happened to them. It was real easy to go missing if you happened to be Jewish, but if you were any kind of dissident, and that meant even being a Surrealist poet or an artist, Max Jacob, Robbie Adesno, and people like them, they were gone. Now she knew what had happened, and she was going around looking and photographing in close-up to see if any of those dead people were her missing friends. Way after the war ended, she returned to London. And to her astonishment, she found she was a hero. Vogue could not get enough of her. They sent her across to America. Roland went with her. And when the victory tour was over, they went and found Max Ernst, now living in Arizona. He had split from Peggy Guggenheim, and he was with the new love of his life, Dorothea Tanning. Her work was becoming well established, but perhaps partly because splitting with Guggenheim had upset a lot of dealers, Max was not selling at all. And Lee was conscious of a certain rivalry and tension between him and Leonora. Then Lee and Roland flew on to Los Angeles, where Man Ray had gone to live and work. Here he is in his studio with Roland. Man Ray had fled Paris in 1940, just ahead of the German occupation. Addie could not go with him. She couldn't get an exit visa. The separation broke that relationship. But now Man Ray's new partner was Juliette Browner. She was a dancer in Martha Graham's company. And a few months later, Man Ray, Juliette, Max, and Dorothea had a double wedding. Man Ray declared he could not imagine doing something so rectangular. I'm not sure what he meant by that, but it can't have been bad because both couples stayed together until they were parted by death. Back in England, Lee and Roland married in 1947, a few months before I was born, and my first 18 months were in London, and then in 1949 they bought Farley Farmhouse, an old Sussex farm, typical of the area, a bit neglected by the wartime austerity. Max Ernst and Dorothea Tanning were among our first visitors, and looking at the way Lee's photographed Dorothea, it's a bit like one of Max's collages with her head stuck on back to front. And Lee later photographed both of them for the pages of Vogue magazine, and it reminds us of the time way before when she photographed Max and Marie-Bette 20 years earlier in Paris. Dorothea was American, but they both preferred Europe, and they settled in France, first at Selim, and then here at Huim, where you see them. Max died in 1974, and Dorothea returned to America, where she lived in New York. She continued to work and stayed in touch, and from time to time visited, until she died in 2012, 7 months short of her 102nd birthday. Picasso came to Farley Farm in November 1950, and he and I, for that is me, made instant friends. I took him to meet one of my favorite people on the farm, our great big Ayrshire bull called William. And that evening, Picasso sat by the fire and painted William like this. You see, Ayrshire bulls are red and white, so he's red and white, but he's grown wings and he's got two friends and he's perched on a twig. It was Picasso's wonderful homage to William. Later, we visited Picasso in his homes in Provence. I found he had a wonderful presence. Instinctively, I knew I was in the company of a person who was truly a great man. Yet he was modest. He was gentle. There was never a hint of ostentatiousness. Braque came round while we were there. He and Picasso had not seen each other for some years, but Picasso grabbed this handful of pottery doves, gave them to Braque as an ice-breaking gesture. And from that moment on, the two old pals picked up where they left off. And Picasso's holding a baby he made out of broken pots. He liked the baby so much, he made a pushchair for her and a mummy to go with her. It was 1954 when Picasso made this work, and François Gillot had left him about a year earlier. And I wonder if his thoughts were turning back to when Claude was very young, and his world was, for a while, filled with happiness. For me, these visits were fun. But Roland was always working on some big project, and in 1958, his masterwork of a biography, Picasso, His Life and Work, was published. It's still in print today. It's acknowledged as being key source material by other scholars. The American edition came out, and the second version had Lee's photograph on the cover. But it was the French edition that was the crucial one, because Picasso didn't read English, but other people told him it was good. So he designed the cover like this. But nonetheless, Roland was very apprehensive when he showed up at Picasso's place. It was nearly 3 years had passed since the English edition. But by then, of course, Picasso had read it. "I've read your book," he said. You can imagine how Roland's heart stopped. "I've read your book. It's good. In fact, it is so good, it is as though we sat at the same table and wrote it together." Nobody can ever give a biographer a better compliment than that. And he signed it like this. Poor Roland Penrose, son ami Picasso, his friend Picasso, with these little guys skipping along the bottom with their bunches of flowers. But by that time, Roland had already curated the 1960s show at the Tate. The show of the century, some people called it. A real blockbuster. Queues round the block at Millbank. Picasso didn't come for the exhibition. He rarely visited his own shows, preferring to concentrate on making new work. And Picasso's projects continued with Roland close up to the time Picasso died in 1973. After the war, Roland and Miro were reunited. As always, Roland was working on new ways of getting Miro's work to be better known. He curated Miro's exhibition at the Tate Gallery in London in 1964. It was the first major exhibition Miro had in Britain. And Roland later wrote the biography on Miro in 1970. And Miro came to visit us in 1964. He was quiet. He was like a little Buddhist monk. He just wanted to sit in the garden, watch the flowers and the birds, and sip tea. He borrowed my dad's crayons, and he made this drawing in our visitor's book at Farley Farm. I think he's drawing the flowers from the garden, and for me there is always a bird in the middle. Miro met another kind of bird with us because we took him to London Zoo, and the keeper of mammals, Desmond Morris, introduced Miro to this hornbill and then to this python. Miro's knees practically buckled when they put it round his neck, but you can see how happy he is with it. A few years after the war, Man Ray and Juliette returned to Paris, and they resumed their close connection with my parents, and I was always so happy when Man Ray came round because it made my mum into a different person. She became happy and carefree and light-hearted, and the way they were together, and indeed you can see it in this photograph, told me something really important, that love, when it's real, is a thing of the heart that lasts forever. And it's not just about looking good when you're young. Man Ray died in 1975. But in that moment, what none of us knew was that Lee was soon to be diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. She lived just long enough to meet our eldest daughter, Amy, before she died at Farley Farm, 27th of July, 1977. Do you remember Valentine? She became a frequent visitor to Farley's because she and Roland became close friends, and she was very close to my mum, and she lived with us for long periods, and she died at Farley Farm in 1978. In the space of a year, Roland had lost the two women he loved most. He was devastated, but he found his way back into making collages in a studio at the bottom of our garden. He traveled widely, and the collages reflect the places he visited. This one is from Kenya, Sri Lanka. After each trip, he brought home new work he had done during his travels. He had 2 shows of new work, one in London at the Mayor Gallery in Cork Street, and another at Gallery Henri Gomis in Paris. He had a third, much bigger exhibition planned for it in 1984, but on his return from a trip to the Seychelles, he had a massive stroke, and he died in his home on Lee's birthday, 23rd of April, 1984, a few days before that show of recent collages, including this one, opened at the Gardner Centre in Brighton. Today, my parents' old home at Farley Farmhouse has become a place of pilgrimage. My daughter, Amy, do you remember the baby? That is she. She is my co-director, and she helps to run the place and greet visitors who come from all over the world. And the house has become more than a time capsule full of interesting objects from the past. It's a living attestation to the friendship of a small group of people who had a huge influence on the art of the 20th century. And at the core of them, marching with them, part of them, were my parents, 2 Surrealists who, along with the others of that movement, stood for peace and freedom and justice and inclusivity, values that are as crystal clear importance today as they were then. Thank you so much for honoring my parents too.